Adaptations are tricky things. No one ever really likes them. The book is always better than the film. There's simply more to look at, more to dissolve. A book is more of an active medium than a film. The world of a book, therefore, always looks better in your head. But adaptations can find success. They can do interesting things. Some flawed adaptations of great books have become more successful and critically acclaimed than the books themselves. Some film adaptations have even made the contents of the work they're based on more digestible for audiences. But what if I told you there's adaptations that not only alter the plot elements from a book, but also the theme of the book itself? Sometimes, on rare occasions, this actually turns out to be a good thing. But most of the time, it turns out to be a bad thing. And that's partly what I'll be discussing today. Hello ladies, gentlemen, and all beasts winged or hoofed alike. I'm Traversing the Dark, and I'll be your guide through the forest of dark fantasy and science fiction. Welcome back to my Masters of Darkness series, where I'll be looking at some of the key writers, books, films and video games that take a walk on the darker side of these often underappreciated genres. Today, I'll be tapping into Richard Matheson's masterpiece of sci-fi horror, I Am Legend, most famous for its ability to effortlessly weave both genres of science fiction, specifically post-apocalyptic fiction, and horror together in a unique way that hadn't really been done before, considering that the novel was first published in 1954. Sci-fi is usually seen as the genre of social progress, especially in the early years of the 1920s and 30s, in what's termed the golden era of science fiction. Stories in this time were akin to Victorian's children's books. Adventures of men bravely going where none had gone before, battling aliens in outer space, or going toe-to-toe with cosmic interdimensional horrors. It's said that the 1950s were a transitional period for the genre. The New Age period of the 60s and 70s, containing much less positive visions for humanity's future, wasn't quite there yet. For that, we needed writers like Matheson. His book rejected the notion that humanity was destined for greatness, and presents us instead with a vision of a post-apocalyptic wasteland born from the spread of a virulent disease. It's a story premise that goes back to Mary Shelley's The Last Man of 1829. Yup, that 16-year-old prodigy who wrote Frankenstein also wrote post-apocalyptic fiction, though she was doomed to be associated with one novel forever. But what was different about the ailment in I Am Legend is that its victims returned to life, or technically, unlife, as vampires. No, not that kind. Not that kind. We're certainly on a right track, but it's not where I'm wanting to go. That's more like it. Nice and feral. The bloodsuckers in I Am Legend are genuine, honest-to-goodness vampires. Creatures that rise to feed on the living and turn them into one of their corrupted brood. As the unnamed virus spreads unchecked throughout the world, our protagonist, Robert Neville, holes up in his Los Angeles suburban home and prays every night for the dawn. His wife and child have already succumbed to the virus, and he has been forced to kill them. As the only known human with absolute immunity to the disease, Neville lives a life constantly tormented by the bloodsuckers from outside. Every night they stalk to his boarded-up home and, with his blinds drawn, he hears them scratch against the walls of his fortress. The vampire horde is led by Neville's old neighbour, Ben Cortman, who seems to be the only one of the infected capable of speech. Funnily enough, we're told through flashbacks that Ben was a kind of Ned Flanders archetype, a cheerful man, always saying good morning with a newspaper in one arm and a mug of coffee in the other, probably with an obligatory number one dad on its side. Now, he has become Neville's chief tormentor. Struggling with alcoholism, complete loneliness, and depression, Neville's situation seems hopeless. He spends months as the vampire's plaything, but then, gradually, starts to learn more about the nature of the disease after multiple visits during the day to his city's public libraries. And then, finally, he starts to fight back. I Am Legend is the story of a war of one against many. A classic example of sci-fi's golden era ideas. Neville is the final bastion of humanity, our beacon of hope against the rising hordes of darkness. The interesting thing about the original novel is that he is just a man. Every adaptation seems to have this obsession with Neville being a scientist or some kind of high-intellect thinker. In reality, he's nothing but an isolated man, and one who begins to develop a logical look in life. He has a problem, vampires, and he sets out to fix it. One of the great tongue-in-cheek ideas in the book is how it presents the vampire threat with scientific credibility. Neville peruses book after book on viral infections and books on vampire mythology to try to find logical connections between the vampire's behaviour and the tools he can use against them. For example, he can ward off a bloodsucker with a crucifix or garlic and lines his house with these items. There's no more churchgoers or queues at the shopping mall to worry about, after all. But he needs to know why these work. Why would a vampire who, in life, believed in Islam be scared of the Christian cross? Why would a Buddhist exhibit the same fear? The answer lies in the notion Neville learns about called hysterical blindness. The infected have awoken and look like vampires. They act like them, they behave like them, they react to sunlight just as they do, they have burning red eyes just like they do from legends, and knowing these classic stories about vampires, they now delusionally act in their feral state like they are vampires from legend. Neville also discovers that exposing the vampires to sunlight causes the bacteria in their cells to switch from being anaerobic symbionts to aerobic parasites, rapidly consuming their hosts when exposed to air, and thus giving them the appearance of instantly liquefying. I love these cheeky scientific rationales behind the horror in the story. It was one of the first books to add this sense of realism and bring something from horror mythology into the modern world through the means of science fiction, however far-fetched some of these ideas may seem. Neville learns that there are also two types of vampires: fully conscious ones living with a worsening infection, and totally undead ones who have been partly reanimated. But to him, the difference is a moot point. Neville's depression starts to increase when he meets a dog that turns out to be infected and dies. But the rage of Neville is directed inward, and his own desire for the companionship of another creature in this new world. He was getting disgusted at this increasingly nostalgic preoccupation with the past. It was a weakness, he knew. A weakness he could scarcely afford if he intended to go on. To Neville, his preoccupation with the world as it was is wrong. It's what's keeping him slow, dim-witted and emotional. To survive, he realizes, he has to find something else. He needs a project. So Neville begins experimenting. He captures vampires from their hiding places throughout the city and takes them to his home, because during the day they are completely incapacitated. Sometimes he does nothing more than throw them out in the street and watch them burn. Other times he tests his new tools on them, finding a wooden stake hammered through the heart to be one of the best means of execution. After some experiments on his captives, Neville starts going hunting. Over countless months, Neville drives stake after stake into the hearts of vampires across the city, marking off their cleared territories on a map as he goes. At sunset, he returns to his home and weathers the cries and attacks on his boarded-up fortress till the dawn comes. And gradually, without even realizing it fully, he becomes accustomed to this daily routine. To Neville, the killing of vampires throughout the day and the old rituals of heading out, working your day job, grabbing a beer after work, and then coming home to relax have become one. His unflinching killing of monsters becomes a part of his life. Morality, after all, had fallen with society. He was his own ethic. Less and less vampires start coming to his house at night, and Neville allows himself a smile of victory as he watches their numbers dwindle. He does not discriminate during his daily hunts. Man, woman, and child bloodsucker are his targets. At this point, we need to talk about two things: desensitization and hedonic adaptation, because these concepts, distinctly human in nature, are the real sources of horror in I Am Legend. you'll know the concept of desensitization. The modern usage is often associated with youths becoming increasingly numb to violence through media like TV shows and, of course, the ultimate boomer boogeyman, video games. But desensitization in its earliest usage actually refers to a psychological treatment for anxiety, going back to the research of psychologist Mary Cover-Jones' work on fear in 1924. Desensitization is broadly defined as the treatment or process that diminishes emotional responsiveness to a negative, aversive, or positive stimulus after repeated exposure to it. Desensitization asserts that after repeated exposure to a stimulus that would once produce stress and anxiety, the stimulus becomes an ingrained part of life. Soon, things that once produced horror are regulated to just another fact of basic, everyday routines. This is what our protagonist Robert Neville begins to experience regarding the act of killing. For him, the word horror had become obsolete. A surfeiting of terror made terror a cliché. To Robert Neville, the situation merely existed as natural fact. It had no adjectives. We can combine this with our second psychological notion, hedonic adaptation, to get a fuller understanding of what is happening to Neville as the novel progresses. Hedonic adaptation is the theory that after a certain period of lived experience, we obtain a kind of stable level of happiness that we always return to, no matter the experiences we undergo that we'd expect would alter our emotions. Such alterations are at best temporary. For example, you win the lottery one day and experience a burst of happiness like adrenaline running through your veins, but according to recorded statistics, winners tend to return to their previous levels of happiness once the novelty of the winning experience wears off. In the same way, according to researchers who coined this theory, Philip Brickman and Donald Campbell, as a person makes more money, expectations and desires run in tandem, which results in no permanent gain in happiness. The same can be said for negative experiences in our lives. The death of a parent will have a profound effect on us in its immediate aftermath, and will serve as a fixture in our memory, but given time, we will return to our previous base mental state. After positive or negative events, and a subsequent increase in positive or negative feelings, people return to a relatively stable, baseline level of affect. There are plenty of criticisms that have been levelled at hedonic adaptation as an idea since its conception. Notably, considerations such as the onset of depression in individuals and other fluctuations in mental health, not to mention the effect of stimuli experienced in war. But I provide it alongside desensitization simply as a lens through which we may understand the psychology behind Robert Neville's gradual shift as a character. Because not only does he become numb to violence, eventually, he starts to enjoy it. We see this most clearly when he considers what he'd do if he ever found the hiding place of his neighbour and vampire leader Ben Cortman. Neville wondered again what he'd do if he found Cortman. True, his plan had always been the same, immediate disposal. But that was on the surface. He knew it wouldn't be that easy. Oh, it wasn't that he felt anything towards Cortman. It wasn't even that Cortman represented a part of the past. The past was dead. He knew it and had accepted it. No, it wasn't either of these things. What it probably was, Neville decided, was that he didn't want to cut off a recreational activity. Neville, we come to realise, has adapted to his new environment so completely that he doesn't want the war to ever end. The old happiness he had shopping, driving his car, heading to the movies or dining out with his wife has been replaced with the relentless murder of vampires in their sleep. He doesn't want to kill Ben. He wants him and his old neighbour to be locked in this game of death forever. It's therefore surprising to Neville when later in the novel he finds another surviving human by the name of Ruth. He's at first shocked and then enthralled by her. She is a quiet, unassuming and frightened young woman, but Neville decides to confide in her, even as she is repulsed by his grisly descriptions of his daily activities. When he offers to test her to ensure she is not infected, she knocks him out and leaves his home in a hurry. But she also leaves him with a note that explains everything. Ruth is an infected, but a member of the conscious infected, those vampires who are fully cognizant as opposed to the feral undead ones Neville sees at night. Her note suggests that, over the years, infected like her have slowly overcame their disease and have been building an underground society where they live freely. Ruth admits that she was sent to the surface as a scout to discover Neville's location and spy on him, and she reveals that Neville has been responsible for countless deaths of her kind. See, Neville hasn't been distinguishing between vampires. He's been killing them all indiscriminately as they sleep during the day. In the process, many fully intelligent members of this new society have died by his hand, including Ruth's own husband. Neville realizes the jig is up. The new vampires will be coming for him. He at first plans to surrender peacefully, but upon seeing their army annihilate both his neighbour Ben and the rest of the feral vampires with machine guns, he decides to open fire and fight back. He's easily shot, subdued, and then taken to their headquarters. There he meets Ruth again, where he is told he is to be executed as a genocidal murderer. But Ruth, not wishing for her society to become barbarous, offers him fast-acting suicide pills instead. Neville accepts, asking her to ensure the new society pursues a path of peace. Before he swallows the pills and dies, he looks out his prison window and sees the infected vampires staring at him with the same hatred and fear he once felt for them. He understands that their desire to kill him after he has killed so many of their loved ones is not something he can condemn, and, looking on as children cling to their mothers just at the sight of him, he knows that he has now become an evil creature of mythos, just as vampires once were to humans. Full circle, a new terror born in death, a new superstition entering the unassailable fortress of forever. I am legend. Matheson's book ends as a cautionary tale of human desensitization and adaptation, where the horror of the story is humanity's ability to adapt, the very aspect of ourselves so central to our evolutionary process. Because of this, the book has retained its timeless quality. But now, I have to return to the point I made at the start about adaptations, because despite I Am Legend's engaging thematic twist, all of its film adaptations fail in the exact same way. They don't depict it. Instead, they all present Neville's death as the sacrifice of a Christ-like figure who is going to kickstart the reign of humanity again. Vincent Price's Neville, in The Last Man on Earth, dies in a church shootout with the infected, defiant to his last breath, with cries of "freaks, mutations" on his lips. Charlton Heston's Omega Man has Neville discover the cure to the virus and hand this off to a group of survivors before slumping to his death in a Christ-like pose that's about as subtle as a cow eating ice cream on a golden unicycle. Will Smith's 2007 depiction similarly has Neville find the cure to the virus and valiantly sacrifice himself to kill the last of the infected. Is it possible that every film director simply didn't understand the key thematic premise of the book? Matheson's story presents a man who adapts so completely to violence that murder becomes not only permissible, but enjoyable. Conceptualizing Neville as a Christ-like sacrificial lamb dying to restore or resurrect humanity misses the point so much that it's almost insulting to Matheson's memory. Neville isn't a saviour of humanity. He's a statement of our inherent capacity to become the very monsters we array ourselves against. So why are these endings all so different? The answer perhaps can be found in the initial responses to Will Smith's movie version. Two endings were planned. One where Neville sacrifices himself to save the cure for the virus, and one where he releases a captive infective that he realizes is all the vampires, called Dark Lurkers in the film, want from him. Test screenings found that audiences massively disliked the latter version, which fits more in line with the book's message, and instead preferred the more hopeful religious allegory of the first. And so the producers went with that version. It's sad to think that a faithful adaptation was halted by the desire for mass appeal, similarly to the original ending of Little Shop of Horrors. But it could be that audiences simply didn't want, or weren't ready for, a misanthropic exploration of humanity's faults as a species. Maybe this is something we're still struggling to get past, a remnant of the golden age of sci-fi that's with us still. Or In a culture where a movie like Avatar is a hugely successful piece of cinema, a film where humanity is literally reduced to nothing more than the bad guys, maybe we're starting to change our minds. Either way, a sequel to the 2007 film has been announced, even though that makes no sense in the film's context. So there might be some hope that at least the core theme of Matheson's work can be communicated to film-going audiences soon. To be fair to it, Will Smith's version isn't all bad. It does get across Neville's loneliness and growing aggression as only Will Smith could, but it does contain a scene of gratuitous mannequin murder. Viewer discretion is advised.
If you're real, you better tell me right now! Damn it, Fred!
I'm sorry that you had to see that. If the struggle between man and vampire is more interesting to you than man versus mannequin, I'd recommend you pick up the sci-fi masterwork version of the book. It's short, readable, and poignant, a timeless classic that perfectly married horror and sci-fi before it was cool, and it's a stark portrayal of the true horror of human nature. Cheers for watching the Scottish Falcon Mage talk about why humans suck. If you're interested in more videos from me in terms of reviews, commentary, or excerpts from my own writing, consider subscribing so you don't miss any new content. And until next time, make sure to check under your bed.